Well, good morning, maybe good afternoon for some. I hope you're having a fantastic day today. And we're going to start another broadcast that we're doing in conjunction with the group effort that Terry Francis and I have in regards to improving our own individual work as evangelists and maybe giving back a little bit to others. And so Terry will be joining us in just a moment as we are going to be dealing with a pretty challenging subject, particularly for younger preachers, whether young in experience or young in understanding or young in age even. And that's in dealing with criticism. It's a challenge. It's a struggle that any context, whether it's in the work of preaching, whether it's in the work of our day-to-day lives as Christians. And we'll let Terry get settled in here as he is able to join us live from a remote location, perhaps maybe a little bit undisclosed.
But
it's good to have Terry with us. Terry, I've already introduced our subject a little bit, so everything going okay for you?
It is going well, so it's not, hope, can you hear me good? We're making sure we got good coverage here. Does it test out all right?
Pretty well.
Okay.
Yep, I can hear you just well enough. A little slight delay, but I think that will probably balance out.
Okay, so yeah, I'm at the hospital. For those who don't know, my mom's having a slight procedure this morning. It's also the weird camera angle. We'll try to figure that out as we go along. So we'll be fine and look forward to our discussion on criticism today.
Terry and I are going to break out a couple of topics for us, and we're going to really try our best to segregate it into two quick realms. The areas that criticism come from often fall into either justified or unjustified criticism, and our goal is really to sort through all of that, process it in a healthy way, and then leverage forward to maybe a little better position afterwards. And so let's start with the easier of the two, perhaps, to begin with, and that's really what we might consider justified criticism. Terry, what would you like to share with us to begin with?
Well, there's some criticism that obviously is justified. I will tell you that none of us are perfect. Regardless of how hard we try to make sure we do everything the right way, we will always end up doing things in a way that sometimes isn't let's say, the best way. And so sometimes people have a good explanation or a good suggestion from that standpoint for us to consider. And so it's justified in that sense.
Yeah. Let me lay this out there too. Terry and I have talked, and particularly in the first years of our preaching, and maybe as a general truth, he and I both struggle with processing criticism well. I'll speak on my behalf. He can speak on his. And even when it's justified criticism, it's a meal that's difficult to swallow. And even when it's coming from the right place, the right person, in the right time, it doesn't always sit well, in the sense that I often kind of cling to the wrong parts of it. I hold on to the pain, the failure. I digest it in different ways. And so, constructive criticism given from the right source, the right place, still has some edges on it that have to kind of be peeled off first before you can get to the lump that's the best part of that information that's being shared with us.
Yeah, I think the one thing to keep in mind is that constructive criticism or justified criticism still hurts. It hurts a lot.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing I think. It's interesting, the people who give constructive criticism seem to think because it is justified that it's painless, which is not true.
Yeah. And this is a parallel that connects it to it. Because you're a preacher, you should have a thick skin. It's my contention that the general way in which you build a thick skin is that you become calloused to the comments on the outside, but the pain still lingers on the inside, and it's not healthy in that sense. And so kind of breaking those things off, in the core of any of those justified comments is going to be some tremendous value. some tremendous insight that comes from a lot of different places. Maybe it comes from someone who has been preaching the gospel for 20, 30, 40 years, and they're providing you insight that allows you to see so much farther than you can as a new preacher. I want to encourage you that if it comes from some place like that, get your book out, get your notes out, and write down every word, even the ones that highlight your own failures, and learn to dissect it in a way that says, okay, I don't want to do this again. My brother who loves me told me some great advice to not move that same way. How can I re-impact the event again? And this time, instead of having a collision, have a stepping stool. That next time a little better off.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the constructive criticism is helpful. I think the hard part for us to understand in all that is we do want to be better. If you don't want to be better, that's a whole other issue. But we want to be better. And the only way to be better is if you tell us how. It's interesting. For me, I'm going through my second phase of teaching a teenager how to drive. And in the process of that, there are times I have to speak to my daughter about what she did wrong, and she gets extremely defensive and doesn't want to listen. Well, in those cases, we have a talk about criticism and about the fact that what's at stake here is safety and quite literally your life. And we can see it from those standpoints. In those cases, criticism is necessary. Hey, you can't stop that fast. Or, hey, when I told you to go forward and you kept the car in reverse, you almost hit the house. Those kind of things are important to talk about. And so when you are the one giving the criticism in that case, you see the value in that, and you also see the reaction. And it goes back to what I said earlier, that all criticism is painful, all of it, even the criticism that is right. Dan DeGarmo posted on here, and I would agree with this, I was terrible in processing any kind of criticism because it poured salt on the wounds of my own insecurity. That's the core of why constructive, justified criticism is so difficult to listen to. But it is needed. And I think that's the easier part. We could almost put that to bed and spend the next 20 minutes talking about the other kind of criticism, which is much harder.
Yeah. I'm going to connect a piece together that talks about how we process these differentials pretty well. Years and years ago, I'm not going to say how many, but a lovely Christian woman told me after a sermon that she had never heard so many Bible passages in one sermon. As a young preacher, I took that as a positive statement. But yeah, that was so good. As a slightly grayer, more mature preacher, I realize now that she was probably trying in her own way to kind of gently redirect me to think about, hey, maybe you could spend a little more time explaining some concepts and connecting some pieces, particularly on this subject in general. It would have been much more profitable to have done so. And so criticism was given. It was certainly justified. They tried to veil it in a little bit of gentleness, a little bit of comedy. But in the end, we've got to learn to kind of say what's there. Now, let me add one more thing about to kind of tie these principles together, especially if you're going to be one bringing forth a suggestion. Timing is of paramount importance. When you give the criticism, it's going to be received differently. And so if you criticize the preacher in the back of the building after the sermon, it's a hard thing to understand, but there's an equivalent emotional endorphin dump that takes place, kind of the adrenaline impact of after a football game where you've pumped yourself up for a task and now it's all over. On the preacher's standpoint, and this is a warning for all young guys, you are going to be the most sensitive to the impact of your sermon at points like that. And so know that ahead of time. You can try to advise brethren not to offer that criticism at that time, but it's not going to work. They're still going to come talk to you. And so you've got to get better at processing it. And some of them will probably turn around and maybe learn a little bit better from it?
Yeah, so another aspect of my life is club soccer. We've done that for 6 years. And our last couple of coaches have had what they call the 24-hour rule, which is as a parent or a player, you're allowed to talk to the coach about anything, but you're required to wait 24 hours after the event before you say anything. And that's a really good idea, by the way, because it causes you to filter everything out, how you're going to say it. And a lot of times by waiting 24 hours, you don't say anything because it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, and there's a shift that we can kind of bring in here, and let's kind of talk a little bit about the other half, unjustified criticism. I think there's some sources that we need to kind of segregate out there as well. The first layer of criticism that preachers think about, and this is actually a short time frame, is criticism that comes from the world. When it comes to your preaching, for the most part, the world is not going to be complaining about your delivery. They're not going to be complaining about how you dress. They're not going to complain about your diction, your vocabulary, your education, any of those things. In reality, unjustified criticism from the world is pretty easy to process. You can remind yourself that they didn't love Jesus, they didn't love his message, and on the same component, they're probably not going to love you, and they're probably not going to love your message either. And so that's an easy one to process. But what about when it's closer to family, if you will, within the bounds of Christ, within the family of Christ? Terry, what's your perspective on the first layer of thinking about what we've called unjustified criticism in the household of God, at least?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I have learned the hard way over time that even unjustified criticism sometimes can be instructive, and there can be things you can gain from it even when it's unjustified. And I know that sounds contrary to the wording, and it may not be what their criticism is, but if you think about their criticism, you might find something you could have done better to avoid that. So I would caution us to always, whether we think it's justified or unjustified, treat it initially as being justified and see what truths we can find out of it and what we might be able to gain from it. The worst part about the unjustified criticism is that it is painful, you will be very injured, and it is almost always, let me say this, almost always not handled properly in how you receive it. And I think that's an interesting piece to that. Almost every bit of unjustified criticism I feel I've received has always come via gossip rather than face-to-face. And that's an aspect of this we've not got into yet, Phil. But I think that's also what makes it even harder on that aspect, is that not only do we feel like it's unjustified, but it wasn't handled properly from the beginning in that sense.
Yeah, I've got a number of men who have reached out to me and talked to me in different ways about how they handle criticism. And one thing that they never is almost uniform is they never accept anonymous criticism. If it's not connected to a person, a place, and a time, that makes it difficult to grow from, because we are not able to then connect it to, this is what I did. This is what I said. This is where I was. This is what we were doing. Let me add something to this 24-hour concept. We need a boundary on the other end too. Certainly that waiting period, allowing kind of some settling of the dust, if you will, is valuable. But, if you wait 6 months, a year, 2 years to bring up a legitimate or an illegitimate complaint, it's going to be basically at that point, I'm hurt and I didn't resolve it. It's no longer, the goal is missed so far from what you're able to do then. It's just so stretchy as a point of reference at that point.
Yeah, that becomes, to me, if you are waiting to give me what you think is constructive criticism 6 months, you need to understand that's going to feel like a personal attack and not constructive criticism.
Yeah.
And that's the difference. And And I think that's the challenge. Now, let's get into this. In Matthew 5 and Matthew 18, there's instructions from both sides of an offended brother. And when you combine those together, what you really find off of the first principle is if you know there's a problem, you're supposed to go take care of it, not let that sit and fester and wait. And that should apply to both sides of this equation. Matthew 18, though, if you have and while that's talking about the offense of a sin, I think there's some principles to that can be applied to what we're talking about here. And so I want to say to members, first off, that may be listening, if you have a concern with the preacher, go talk to the preacher about that. And allow him to hear that from you, and the two of you discuss that. If you are not willing to do that, then it is not justified criticism.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing to keep in mind is that if somebody is not willing to do that, then it's not going to be justified. If you can't speak that face to face to me, and you feel like it has to come to me anonymously, then that's not going to be constructive criticism. It will not be received that way, perhaps is the best way to put that.
Yeah, and you could add one more tidbit to this. I know there's a huge struggle to deal with the perception of the size of a preacher's ego. A lot of folks think, oh, these guys are all big, giant, and Terry and I are pretty loud people. We're big in our behavior, we're big in our stature, all of that stuff. Bring a third party that is recognized by both you and the person you're trying to work with, just to sit there and say, here you go. I'm here to kind of talk to the both of you and to serve as a translator of both fact and emotion. You'll find that third party participant, which the Bible actually talks about, brings balance to a conversation that might otherwise be uneven, and really is a great principle. It can give you more courage. It can allow folks to get a little more gentle. And so I think there's a lot of benefit to doing that, and doing it in a reasonable amount of time has to be keyed together. It takes it from, like we've talked about, unjustified to potentially being justified criticism in the sense of its value and its applicable nature.
Yeah, and let me add to that I have heard over the years when people would, what normally happens here, by the way, just so we're all honest and upfront, is members don't come to the preacher, they go to the elders. The elders receive that criticism in most cases that I am familiar with, both personally and in conversation with others, is that the elders sit on that information, sometimes from anywhere from 6 months to a couple of years. And then when things kind of get to a point where they think the preacher and them have this issue, there's this kind of come to Jesus meeting, if you will, and all of those things are dumped on the table at once, and sometimes they're years old, you're not told who it was, and all those things. When that's happened to me, and I've said, well, why won't people talk to me about this? The response is, well, they're intimidated by you. What I find interesting about that, by the way, Phil, is in the rare cases when somebody came and talked to me and we talked those things out, a lot of times somebody would say, that was far easier than I thought it would be. And I just say this to say it this way. Don't forget this fact that we are brothers. Your preachers are also your brother in Christ. And we're good guys. We really are. And we're not going to lynch mob you because you come and tell us that you think that we could have handled something better. And so I think that's one of those cases. I was told one time, by the way, because we're talking about Matthew 18 and that, I was told one time also in that conversation, I'm going to deal with this because it's important. When I asked one time, why wasn't Matthew 18 practiced here? If this person came and talked to you as elders, why did you not then tell them to come talk to me before you listen to them and all of that? And I was told, well, Matthew 18 doesn't really apply to you. I just want to point out and say there's no caveat in Matthew 18 that says if you're the preacher, that process doesn't apply. And so I just want the members that may be listening again to consider that and to realize that in this family of God, that when we have issues, when we have problems, when we have any kind of conflict, we're supposed to go talk that out, not talk about it to everybody else, regardless of what position that person may hold within the congregation. And that's an important part to deal with this issue of criticism. I will tell you, for me, it is far easier to handle criticism when I receive it from the actual person who is being critical rather than receiving it second and third party.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And you've already brought up Matthew's great instruction that Jesus, Matthew's record of great instruction from Jesus. We'll add this from James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. There's 3 steps to a conversational reconciliation that he talks about there, as we can kind of break the text out. Being quick to hear, slow to speak, and then slow to become angry, in essence. You think about how that changes if, and we'll talk about best case scenario, both parties approach a conversation as being good listeners and invest in a lot of how are you feeling, tell me what you saw, tell me what you understood, and then listen in that regard, and then try to make sure they put a clamp down on the emotional side of things. Here's a balance to it, and knowing a lot of preachers like I do, and Daniel already talked about his response of insecurity. Most public personalities, people who are extroverts, have a core inside of them that is a tightly pulled string of insecurity. And that insecurity kind of is pulled like a one-string banjo that's never in tune. And so you start pulling on it, it really becomes an irritation on the inside of the person, and eventually becomes an irritation of all forms and all types. And so it's really valuable then to say, okay, if this is how it's going to be, let's create an environment where the conversation can be healthy and helpful in that sense.
Yeah, our personalities are big because we are extremely confident. What people don't realize a lot of times is we are overconfident as a way of protecting our insecurities that we try to bury down. And when you come to us and you expose our insecurities, it's a painful process. So Hal Hammond's talked about how, in his comment, preachers don't receive criticism well, and we've kind of alluded to that. I will tell you, I have created a lot of difficulty in my work because I failed to listen and respond to criticism the right way. So anyway, I'm going to have to go, and Phil, I'll let you wrap that up, and appreciate the discussion today.
All right, see you, Terry. Have a great day. Be careful, all you folks who are watching on the broadcast. You might get pulled in here, so it's always possible you'll get asked to join in at some point. So a couple other things that we wanted to make sure that we resolve in our look at this particular issue, and some of the things that are of importance to us. When we are looking at all of these issues, and Terry and I have kind of hit the hem of the garment of some of our own personal experiences, there's some great ways that we can kind of break out and say, now, how do we respond to it? Well, the first thing you need to do in a very simple way is make sure that you listen well to the criticism, even if you feel like it's unjustified. Even if you feel like it's coming from way out of left field and you don't understand it, listen to it well, because there may come a time when you've matured or you've gained a new vantage point that at that point you can now kind of process it in a new way and gain a second value to the first criticism. And so make sure you're listening well. And then in the process of digesting whatever's coming to you, make sure you incorporate a potential for prayer to have its place. Prayer centers a person. It creates a dialogue with God. It strengthens your heart in a number of ways. And that allows you to think through things. It really does give you the chance to process it and separate. Do I value the criticism? Do I value the critic? because we ought to be able to answer both of those things with a yes. That person came to us out of some level of concern, something they saw, something they've seen. Their perspective might be very different. They might not have the experience to put it in a great, box of understanding for us, but it still has value there. And then respond from a perspective of understanding. The response to criticism can come in a number of forms. The obvious response is one of thankfulness. And that's hard to do. Admittedly, for Terry and I both, we've struggled at times with the sting being deeper than we anticipated, and our sense of self-defense kind of turns up and turns in. And so in those, settings and places, it really kind of creates some additional challenges that way for us to move forward into the next step of things. And then there's another time where the response doesn't even need to be something spoken. Sometimes the response is simply thank you, or you may recognize that someone is bringing a part of critical consideration to what you're up to as an evangelist, up to as a preacher, up to as a teacher. And they may not necessarily see from the perspective of experience that would allow them to dig into this particular issue and give great insight. As a simple fact, someone who has been preaching 20 years, if they give me criticism about preaching, if they've been preaching 40 years, if they give me criticism about my work, it's got a lot more value to a certain degree to someone who's never done the work. That doesn't mean their criticism doesn't have value, but it's just kind of a combination of factors as you're breaking down the value of it in that sense. And one more thing to kind of consider in the bigger picture of things is to remember this. The goal of the evangelist is to share the gospel, to teach, and to do so the very best that they can. It is impossible for one guy to know all the ways to do it, to be the very best at it from day one. You will get better. They will profit more from a preacher who improves over time. And so as a group of Christians together, we need to be aware of that. And Terry spoke to members as well. I want to speak a little bit to members too. Be careful on the balance of your criticism. We live in an age right now which is wildly different than how preaching used to be. Some of the guys I've seen pop up are preachers who have served in that role for 20, 30, 40 years. The work is a lot different now. Right now, today, I can go and listen to some of the very best speakers who are experts in their fields on subjects that I didn't even know about in very special areas when I first started preaching. It's not fair to then compare that expert to someone who doesn't have that same level of expertise. But yet we still do that. We even do that in our desires for the kind of preaching we want to hear from the pulpit, the kind of teaching we want to hear in those Bible classes. And we need to do a better job of learning to balance those desires for the best with the way in which we help people become the best. That's it for our time today. We've kind of covered in a number of things. We'll probably spend a little bit more talking about this on the future because I think it's a tool that preachers need to develop well. Hope and pray that Terry's mother's healthcare needs are being handled in the best way possible, and I hope that all of you have a wonderful day. Take care, everybody.